What is going on, YouTube fitness family? What I'm gonna do for you guys is rate some of the most common back exercises and then some of my unique variants on a tier list, from F being the absolute worst trash for hypertrophy. So not for strength, not for performance, but strictly for building muscle. And we're gonna go all the way up to S tier, which is the prime, the Wagyu beef of building great X frame, great lats, cobra backs. So before hopping into these, I wanna tell you guys how I'm rating these exercises. So we're talking about how we can build muscle in the most efficient way. And as we know, scientifically, number one, we need a really good stretch bias. So we need really good range of motion on these exercises. Number two is stability. So when we're talking about really building a good back, so if you're limiting them with, let's say, rotation along axial rotation on the spine and using your core, it's probably not going to be the most effective. Number three is how safely can we load this exercise. So if it's something that is going to be a higher risk of injury, higher CNS tax, and not really a big payoff in terms of hypertrophic outcomes, probably not going to be something that's going to be graded very high. Now conversely, if it's something that we can load very safely, it's a good nice brace position, we get nice long range of motion. And the last thing is going to be, honestly, how much can we like increase the time under tension. As we know, time under tension is very important. So if it's an exercise that's very hard to like use good tempo and cadence based on, let's say, core stability or the fact that it's like unbalanced, probably also going to rate low for me. So I'm going to go through, grade it on those criterion, and we'll see what comes out highest and which comes out lowest. Hopefully it's not your favorite exercise, gets an F grade, because that'd be very sad for you. All right, so I'm just gonna go in strict order. I had like basically picked like 20 plus exercises. I did add some of my unique variants just because I'm fucking goated at this stuff. No, I'm just kidding, but I actually am. Anyway, you see these fucking lats, bro? Lat spread, dude. Gotta fit the front relax. Yeah, dude, no, it's fucking... It looks worse seated. Definitely looks terrible seated, so just take my word for it. My back's actually kind of decent. Phil splice a little photo in there for when I'm lean, and my back's actually one of my best body parts, so maybe take my word for it. Maybe it's all gear, who knows, but anyway, let's... First exercise is going to be a back extension. So let's go through those criteria. Stretch bias, don't really have an issue there because you can really dig down. And so what we're talking about when we talk about a back extension is usually that 45-degree angle, kind of with the pads that go on your quads. Probably have this in your gym. It's a very good exercise for building glutes and hamstrings, not very good for building like that X frame. So a lot of people think when you do lower back, you're building up what's called like your Christmas tree. So I don't know if you guys seen when guys are really lean and they pull back into like a back double or back lat spread, they pull their elbows back, they get that crazy like Christmas tree looking thing on the lower back. That's not really from like building your lower back or your spinal erectors. That's really from building out your lats, which insert right below your rib cage there. And that's what you're seeing is the kind of lat insertion towards the bottom there. So if you really want that, you actually build your lats out and not your lower back and spinal erectors. So for that reason, obviously you can progressively overload, but when you're progressively overloading it, to me, you're just using more glutes and hamstrings and not really building a very aesthetic back. So for that reason, I'm gonna give it a D grade. It's not F grade because it's not the absolute worst of them all, but it is not gonna be something you wanna have as a staple in your back workout. Moving right along, we have a basically pendulum row, like a bent over dumbbell row, but as you come up with one, you come down with the other. Oh man, this might be my first, I don't know, man. It could be my first F grade exercise. It just anything you're doing unbalanced and you're kind of rotating at the spine back and forth, you're gonna lose a lot of that obviously contraction in the back, and you're using a lot of core and you have nothing to brace against. So like contrary to this, you have like, let's say a single arm dumbbell where you brace that opposite hand and you could really get that peak contraction and a nice big stretch. So for me, this is gonna be an F tier. Sorry for anybody who does this, just stop. The next one we've got looks like a barbell deadlift. This one is gonna catch me some flack here. So the reason being is just because it's a staple, right? It's one of the first like compound exercises. You pick a bar off the ground. It's seemingly simple, right? The issues with it become that you always are gonna want to tend to do heavier and heavier loads, which tend to obviously cause more injuries over time. Maybe not acute injuries, but obviously issues with lower back. Form tends to not be great with people. It is a very complicated exercise. It's multi-lever. You have to keep your chest nice and proud, lower back obviously arched or at least neutral. You have to have good, obviously, mobility through the hamstrings, through the glutes, through the hips. And so for those reasons, it is an exercise that's great to progressive overload. Stretch bias is not there, right? So when we get to the bottom of the rep, it's not gonna get us that nice deep stretch that we're looking for in order to really get that stretch mediated hypertrophy. So yes, it can be a very, very effective way to top end load, especially through your, like I said, spinal erectors, infraspinatus, even lower lat emphasis. But when it comes to building a really, really nice X-frame back, it's just not gonna be in even close to S or A tier. And so for that reason, I'm probably gonna give it C tier just because it doesn't have that stretch bias. The only really way to progressively overload is go heavier and heavier. It's a high risk exercise for people that don't know what they're doing. I'm gonna give it C tier. I don't wanna give it D tier just because I don't want lose any subscribers that love fucking deadlifts, but not something I do often. If I do it, it's in a deficit, and if I do it, it's probably also an RDL, which is going to be more hamstring focused, and that's why I did not include it in this tier list. So the next one, we have a barbell row. The thing about a barbell row is if you're not standing on any platform, same issues arise with the limiting factor being the range of motion. So as you go to the bottom, if you have plates, especially if you have 45-pound plates on there, when you get down towards the bottom of the rep, you are not going to get a huge stretch to the lats, and the floor is going to be the limiting factor in terms of how much stretch you can get. The other thing it's a limiting factor is obviously, core bracing, stability, all the things we talked about. So especially when you're doing a dual compound lift, it's also very CNS taxing, same thing with a deadlift. So you could do a few heavy sets of this, and you might not work your back all that hard, but you might be tired as shit. So when you get to the exercises that may be more effective for hypertrophy for your back specifically, you might be so gassed out that you might not be able to do those exercises. So I would say if this exercise is in a deficit, I'm gonna give it closer to an A to B because we also get the advantage as opposed to the deadlift of a row as opposed to just a pull off the floor. As you row and you retract your scaps, you're gonna get that engagement all the way through the lats, all the way through the infraspinatus, all the way through, and just get a really, really good mind muscle connection and contraction. And then you get a big stretch if you are on a deficit, which we'll get to later. But a traditional barbell row, I'm not gonna give it an A or S due to the stretch limitations, but it's easy to progressively overload. You're probably not gonna be doing it as heavy as you would, let's say, a barbell deadlift. So for those reasons, I'm gonna give it a B tier. So the reverse dumbbell fly. This is a very common exercise I see people doing for back. A lot of times people are wanting to hit their rear delts. When you're doing a reverse fly, same problem happens with that imbalance. So as we get to the top of the rep, those dumbbells are going to want to pull us forward down towards the floor, and that's where we're getting peak contraction. So what I would recommend is if you're going to do these, do let's say a crossover high pull on the cables so you can leverage back so that vector force is similar. Instead of coming from gravity from the floor, you get cables coming from high to mid, and that way you can leverage back, use your body weight and squeeze through. Also, rear delts are not a huge part of the back. They can be very aesthetic when built properly, but I'm not gonna give them a F or D tier. I'm probably gonna give them a C tier just because when they're done correctly, they're not a terrible exercise, but definitely not towards the top of the list. Now, moving on to great timing is this exercise that I like to do, which is a crossover high pull. So we use cables, crossover position. What the crossover position does as compared to that dumbbell reverse fly is now we have the ability to stretch across our body. The other thing is we have better mechanical leverage, meaning because that weight is coming from high to mid, I can lean back and I get really good mechanical tension and leverage without the weight pulling me into the floor. I can use my body weight to almost match. So let's say 80 or 90 in each hand. I can lean back so that I'm almost balanced, so I'm not falling backwards, but I'm not getting pulled forward. This is a very good way to get better peak contraction. So if I'm here and that I don't have to worry about getting pulled forward because my angle of my body is basically counter levering that, it's gonna allow me for better stretches, better peak contraction. So for this, I'm gonna give this an A tier because it's my exercise and I'm a fucking legend. Essentially, it has to get at least an A tier if I did it. So the next one, it looks like we have a barbell or a dumbbell bent over row. Let's go through the criteria. Does it have a good stretch bias? Technically, yes, especially if you can set up on, let's say, an slightly inclined bench. So instead of being 100% parallel, you get a little more height, and that way you can get more stretch and actually reach towards the bottom of the rep and then pull the chest open, retract the scaps, good squeeze, at the top. Only limiting factor here is obviously gravity kind of pulling you forward. I do really love isolateral pulling movements, meaning one hand or the other. It allows us to drive a lot of load without having to worry as much about our lower back, because what we can do is brace with that other hand, and now we can kind of lean out, expose that lat with a really good amount of weight in that stretch position, using that other hand to brace, and then drive up, and we can really pull that shoulder back and really retract that scapula, as compared to, let's say, when we're doing a dual row. You see how much more I can reach back and squeeze through? That's why isolateral pulling, to me, cables are gonna be the #1 option, but even a barbell or dumbbell row, when done really well, can be extremely hypertrophic. So for me, based on all those things, super easy to progressively overload within reason, pretty low injury risk, just because you're not doing a big dual compound row. For me, that is going to get an A tier exercise. Now, moving on to another exercise, which I do frequently, which is a deficit Smith machine row. So the reason that I love this exercise, it meets all the criteria. You get a really good stretch bias. It's very easy to load. You have the ability to almost pull backwards at the same time as you row, because you're in a fixed plane. The Smith machine is allowing you to have that liberty of not having to worry about the barbell going front and back. You get to be on that fixed plane and use a lot more load safely than if we're doing, let's say, just a barbell deficit row. The only reason I'm not going to give these an S tier is because of the fact that the injury risk is still there. It's not as high, but it's still there because you're loading. It's a heavier exercise. You're not braced against everything, so you don't have like a pad to support your chest in order to keep the emphasis out of your lower back. You can move very ergonomically. You can keep a nice proud chest, but those are form cues that if you do not do and you don't have that correct, essentially the risk of injury tends to be higher. So I'm gonna give these A tier, but not S tier. Okay, next we have a bench supported dumbbell row. So this is another really good option if you want to grow your lats, because of the fact that, again, now we have converse to the Smith machine deficit row. Now we have ability to brace against the pad, and we can reach and get a really nice stretch with the dumbbells, and then drive up and get really good scapular retraction. Obviously really low injury risk with the lower back, have a pretty good stretch bias because you can really reach towards the floor. Easy to progressively overload. You get heavier dumbbells, easy to use time under tension. You use straps, really milk that eccentric portion. I think the only thing is, like, ergonomically, I don't quite get as good of a peak contraction just being stuck to the bench, because it doesn't allow me to kind of move ergonomically and pull the chest up and get a big squeeze at heavier loads. This is also going to be an A tier exercise for me, just because of those reasons. It's really safe. It's really easy to progressively overload, but it's also not easy to get that nice big peak contraction like some of the other movements that we are going to talk about. Next one, we have a very serviceable option, which is a essentially body weight inverse row. And what I mean by that is, if you set up like a Smith machine or a barbell on a rack, you go underneath it, you put your feet in front of you, and you almost do a body weight row. The reason I'm gonna rate this highly is you can pretty much do it almost anywhere. You can set up a PVC pipe between two chairs. You can set up a berm between two chairs. This is actually an exercise I did during the pandemic when I didn't have any equipment. So I'd literally use a PVC pipe or a broom between two of my dining room chairs, and then I'd put my feet up on a box to make it harder. For that reason, it's serviceable when you have limited equipment. I don't think it's a terrible exercise. You can really get a big stretch at the bottom of the rep based on obviously the height of the bar. Really almost roll the shoulders over it, turtle shell it, get a big stretch, and then a nice peak contraction. So I think it's a serviceable option, hard to progressively overload, and for that reason, I'm gonna give it C tier. So now we're going to do a kneeling single arm low row. And so this is one that I love, one of my favorite options. The reason being is to get a huge stretch bias, really reach, and then get a big peak contraction. It's very ergonomically sound. You can load it really heavy because you're bracing with that opposite hand. The vector of force is very nice because it's coming from straight in front of you instead of through the floor, just using gravity. So you have a really nice force curve throughout the whole movement pattern. I think it's a tremendous option for just about anybody that wants to grow their back. I feel some of the most crazy lat pumps on this exercise. So I'm going to give myself and this exercise the first S tier. All right, so the next one we have a single single arm landmine row. So it's if you have a landmine set up a bar and then you use a plate or whatever you're using to do a row on the side. I think pretty similar to the dumbbell row, but also it's unbalanced, which makes it a worse exercise for you. You have to do a lot of core stability. If you're an athlete, this could be a very serviceable option for you based on the fact that you have to use your core. It's a little bit more dynamic, let's say a dumbbell row, but for hypertrophy, not very good. You have a very limited range of motion because you put a plate on there, you reach to the floor, the plate's gonna stop very, very early, so you don't really get a good stretch bias. It's really hard to load it because you're unbalanced. So for those reasons, this one's getting a D tier for me. I would leave it out unless you absolutely have no other equipment available. Next one is going to be the lat pull down. Essentially, if you cannot do a pull down with the same weight that your body weight is with really good form, probably should be doing assisted pull-ups or obviously band assisted pull-ups. So I'm still going to give this an A tier exercise. It's been proven over and over scientifically to be a great hypertrophic exercise. That being said, if you start to roll your shoulders over it and use more front delts and biceps, it's probably not going to hit your back very hard. So try to focus less on getting A to B, like the chin over the bar, and focus more on the form that you're utilizing, and you'll have a much better time with obviously how much back hypertrophy you're getting. Renegade Row, fucking trash, just garbage, garbage, garbage. I don't even want to take too much time on this. I think we know. Renegade Row is when you have two dumbbells on the floor, you row up here, put the other dumbbell down and row. It's unbalanced, terrible range of motion. It doesn't really get good peak traction. Usually the back is not your limiting factor with this. It's usually more core stability and strength. Seated row. I think this is a tremendous option as well for growing your back because of the fact that, same thing, if you have a seated row, this is a pro tip, if you have a seated row at your gym that doesn't allow you to get a full stretch, then I would set up boxes, take something and put your feet farther back. So another way you can do is put two dumbbells basically standing up and push them into those foot plates and then put your feet behind the dumbbells. That allows you an extra like 6+ inches of range of motion. If your seated row stops you here and you doesn't allow you to get a big stretch, it's a huge limiting factor for how much hypertrophy you can obviously induce using that movement. For me, if you can maximize range of motion, it's very, very well loaded. It's got that kind of, obviously cables to me are the king of back exercise because that vector of force, that force curve is very, very effective as opposed to something that's just using gravity like a barbell. So for those reasons, seated row is going to be an A tier exercise for me. The only reason I'm not putting it S tier is because of the fact that it is slight, since we're hip hinging, it's a little higher injury risk than let's say like a pull down. So that's the only reason it's getting A and not S. Seated rope face pull. So this is an exercise I do to build the upper back. I think it's a tremendous option for those reasons. You get a huge stretch. This can be a very, very good option. Really, really good peak contraction, really good stretch. Ergonomic hand positioning because you're using a rope. For me, these are going to be A tier. The only reason I'm not putting it in an S tier because for aesthetics and hypertrophy, lats is going to be king to build out that X frame. Upper back, traps, rear delts, rhomboids is not going to be as aesthetic. So it really gives you that like nice full look to your back, but not as much of that kind of crazy X frame. So, and they're smaller muscle groups, so I'm gonna give this an A tier instead of an S tier. T-bar row. This is literally one of my favorite movements growing up. Like I used to load the hell out of the T-bar row with like 6, 7, 8 plates when I played college football. Like literally was so fun. Just for the fun factor, I can't give it even close to like the bottom of the list just because it's a good exercise. We do have the limitations, which are the range of motion. Also peak contraction gets limited because that V grip kind of runs into your kind of too narrow. Man, I want to give this a B or A so bad. I just can't do it. If you do it in a deficit, if you put your feet on boxes, I'm giving this a B. You know what? I'm gonna give this a B because if you can do it in a deficit, get more stretch bias. I cannot give one of my favorite all-time back builders, the V-grip pullover. So pullovers, do not sleep on them, guys. You can do dumbbell lying pullovers. I prefer cables. You have better leverage. You get really good stretch bias. You get a really good pump in the lats. It's not something you can load as heavy as like a pull down or a seated row or a deficit row. So it's probably not going to be as crazy like building as it is more refining and getting that kind of really, really good mind muscle connection and pump. So for those reasons, I'm going to give it A tier. I think it's a great exercise. And then we have a Yates row. So next one we have the Yates row. So it's a very popular exercise popularized by Dorian Yates, who had arguably one of the best backs in bodybuilding history. Yes, he did have the best back. Yes, he did do this exercise frequently. Are they highly correlated? Yes. Is it causation? That means causation? No. I think Dorian had tremendous genetics. He had tremendous muscle bellies. He trained really hard. He trained with really, really good intensity. And I think those are probably the leading reasons that he had the back that he did and had a genetic propensity to grow, especially upper body. He was very upper body dominant and just had really good density. Would I say that this is a terrible exercise? No. So basically the way you do it is you supinate your grip. It's like a barbell Dumbbell row. You load it heavier, it's a little bit more explosive. The supinated grip, in theory, would drive more emphasis into the lats. Like I said, same thing with the limiting factors being that you can't use as much range of motion because most of the time you don't do this in a deficit. You also have higher injury risk of biceps because you're exposing them more, especially under heavy load. For those reasons, I'm going to give it a C tier just because I do think that you can progressively overload it. It's not a terrible movement to add to your repertoire. Would it be probably one of my top options? Also no. All right, let's move on to the bench supported low lat row. This is literally an S tier exercise for me. Probably I show people this, for like, dude, this exercise is insane. Activation's insane. I can load it very safely. Basically what you do is you set up an incline bench and you sit towards the bottom of it. You use the inclined part of the bench to brace. You get a big stretch and you dig underneath. You kind of lean out and squeeze through your lats. I've showed so many professional bodybuilders exercise. Simeon Panda and I just did it. It's a very, very great option. You can use a lot of time under tension safely because of the bracing hand. Crazy range of motion. There's really no limitation in the range of motion because you're going from high to low. So you can reach as high up towards that cable as you want. It's just a goated exercise for me. I've done thousands of different variants for different exercises, and this one just for me is hugely beneficial, and I think it's been a tremendous part of my back development over the especially last 2 to 3 years. And that's gonna bring us to the end. So obviously I had to end with myself because I love myself and I love my exercises and I love my body. I'm just kidding, no. I am gonna be the first person that says I've tried all these exercises. I used to think a lot of these exercises that were in like D tier were like A tier for me, like T-bar row, for example, used to be like a fucking S tier exercise for me. But the more I've learned, the more I understand obviously how to build my back effectively, safely, using really, really good time under tension, scapular retraction, peak contraction, all the things we talked about in this video. So hope you guys like this type of video, style of video. Shout out to Jeff Nippard. I got this inspiration from him, seeing his video. I think we have very different outlooks on some of these exercises, but kind of similar principles. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Remember to subscribe to the channel, like and comment below if you agree or disagree. I'd love to see some discord in the comments. If you guys disagree with me, I love that. I love the conversation. So without further ado, I will see you guys on the next video.